It happened in February 2014. A huge meteorite was flying toward Earth, intending to destroy all life on the planet. An amateur astronomer was the first to discover it. His name was Joe. He was one of those guys who, at 30, still lived with his mother, had a modest income that suited him just fine, and a large belly from a sedentary lifestyle. He worked at the local 24-hour convenience store. He didn't have any friends, but he had a passion for studying space, inherited from his father, who left the family when Joe was 7. On the evening when his father said goodbye to him, he gave Joe a cap with his favorite team's logo and a small, cheap telescope. Joe didn't get into sports, but he did fall in love with astronomy. Every evening he would sit on the roof and watch the stars, sometimes cursing the clouds that blocked his view at the wrong moments. On that ill-fated day, the Super Bowl was taking place, and the entire country was glued to their TV screens. But Joe was not interested in this event. He came home from his shift, changed clothes, brewed some hot coffee, and leisurely climbed to the roof, where he had his mini observatory. It was cold outside, but he dressed warmly and set up a small portable heater next to him. Humming a silly song to himself, he sat on the couch and peered through the telescope's eyepiece. "So, what do we have today?" he said, looking into the lens. These words would become legendary in the future and turn into memes, but he didn't know that then. At that moment, the sky was clear, and Joe was pleased that the clouds wouldn't obstruct his view. But suddenly, his hands began to tremble, and he fearfully uttered, "What is that?" He nervously rubbed his eyes, and then looked through the eyepiece again. As he stared at something, he fearfully muttered to himself, "It can't be, it just can't be." Then he jumped up, started running around the roof, panicking and shouting, "We're all going to die!" Thousands of thoughts raced through his mind. What to do? Who to call? What next? Suddenly he stopped abruptly and ran down to his bedroom. Turning on his computer, he went to the NASA website and started looking for their contacts. Finally finding them, Joe grabbed the phone and dialed the number. The phone rang over and over, but no one answered. Damn it, what are they doing over there? He kept calling, but it was in vain. Then he dialed his acquaintance, a professor who worked at the local university. A disgruntled voice answered on the other end of the line. "Hello? I'm listening." "David, we're doomed. A meteorite is heading for Earth." "What do you mean?" the professor asked. Joe quickly told him all the details. The professor didn't believe him at first, as he was following the game and his mind was elsewhere. But Joe's persistence and frightened voice alarmed the scientist, and he decided to check the sky. For this, he went to the university observatory, and when he looked through the telescope's eyepiece, he almost fainted. From that moment, the wheel of panic began to spin. The news spread like wildfire. One scientist after another confirmed the discovery. This information leaked to the media, and people who had been joyfully watching the main game of the year the day before were now nervously, and some in panic, following any news. At this time, the government convened an emergency conference, and scientists began making calculations, reluctant to announce the impending end of the world until the last moment. The meteorite's size was catastrophic, about 10 kilometers in diameter. They couldn't hide the truth for long, and the information came out. This period was later called the 3 days of worldwide panic. I won't go into detail about what happened then, but briefly, there was complete anarchy. It was the end for humanity. Everyone took the news differently. Some gathered with family, some committed suicide, and some did things they had long postponed. Churches were packed, and the number of atheists sharply decreased. Everyone was seeking salvation and hope. I was 10 years old at the time, and I remember this moment. My father was an extraordinary and upbeat person. He just said we should celebrate the news. He set up a table in the backyard and started grilling. My sister, who was 7 at the time, and I were happily running around the garden, throwing snowballs and building a snowman. We didn't notice that our mother was very nervous. It was harder for her to accept the fact that death was near. But my father entertained everyone as best he could, and the tension eased a bit. Soon night fell. The 4 of us were sitting on the couch that my father had brought out onto the porch from the house, watching the sky. It was bright from the approaching celestial body. We were mesmerized by this deadly beauty. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, someone screamed, someone cried, and gunshots could be heard. The end was near. But suddenly, the meteorite changed its trajectory, sharply turning to the left. It left behind a long, bright trail. It seemed to consist of several materials that chipped off, creating colorful light streaks. It was truly an impressive sight. Suddenly, we heard joyful crying. It was our neighbor, who was sitting behind the fence, watching the sky just like us. Humanity got lucky. Somehow, the meteorite changed its flight path. Scientists around the world racked their brains over how this happened. Everyone understood that by all laws of physics, it should have fallen to Earth. Something influenced it, but what? Speculations and theories quickly emerged. Some said it was the Russians, others said aliens. Gradually, everyone realized it wasn't the end, and there was universal jubilation. Celebrations were held in every country, but soon life returned to normal. The unrest was quelled, and the damage was assessed. Questions were also raised about why scientists, whose work had cost billions of dollars, missed a meteorite that threatened the extinction of all life on the planet. In their defense, the scientists showed scan results of that part of the sky, insisting that this celestial object appeared out of nowhere. This became another mystery that troubled people's minds. During the investigation, journalists identified the person who first discovered the approaching threat. Joe immediately became popular, and his story and quotes spread worldwide. He was frequently on TV and participated in various shows. But then he suddenly disappeared. Where he is now and what he is doing, no one knows. So it seemed the threat had passed, and humanity managed to relax. But exactly 1 month later, on March 2nd, news came that shocked everyone again. In Yellowstone National Park, there is a small, little-known valley called Ghost Valley. This place is in the northeastern part of the park, near the Lamar Valley area, known for its wildlife and scenic landscapes. A hunter discovered an unknown anomaly there. His attention was drawn to a strange flicker on the horizon. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. The closer he got, the clearer it became. Around the valley stood an invisible barrier, barely noticeable, like a mirage in the desert. He decided to go through it and found himself in a vast, dark forest where night reigned. Terrified, he returned, and it became day again. It turned out that the barrier was a portal to an unknown world. This news quickly spread around the world, shocking the planet's inhabitants. No one knew what this anomaly was. The government quickly cordoned off the area, turning it into a second Area 51. But it seemed that this anomaly had intelligence and began to expand to such enormous proportions that it became impossible to completely block access. People found places where they could pass unnoticed. Soon, people who had ventured into this zone and managed to return began to appear. When they gave interviews, their eyes were empty, as if they had experienced something horrific. One of them was Robert Crown. He was a 40-year-old man, an avid hunter, and a lover of all things mystical. I recently re-watched the recording where he talked about what happened to them. I was struck by his appearance. He seemed to have aged significantly, and his face showed that he had endured severe hardships. Even on camera, he did not stop drinking. He held a glass of whiskey, which trembled every time he brought it to his mouth. The reporter impatiently asked him questions, but the man was in no hurry to answer. He closed his eyes as if it was hard for him to remember, then began his story in a hoarse voice. There were 20 of us. All of us were experienced hunters, including former rangers and military personnel. We found each other on a forum dedicated to this topic. One day, one of us, named David, said he had found a path around the government forces that led straight to the barrier. We were thrilled with this news and immediately formed a team. We set off a week later, armed and fully equipped. The path was indeed unguarded, and we finally reached the barrier. Crossing it was not difficult, and we found ourselves in the forest. This forest was enormous, and I don't know if it has an end. The first thing we noticed was the sounds. They seemed no different from those in our world. But we, being experienced, immediately realized something was off. If you listened closely, there was an unfamiliar clicking noise. Soon we found the insect that made this sound. It was a beetle, covered in hair, somewhat resembling a spider, but it had 4 legs, and next to its mouth were sacs that inflated and produced that very clicking sound. One of us, named Jack Matthews, decided to touch it. We tried to stop him, but he was on a high, you understand. We were pioneers. Our eyes were full of enthusiasm, our minds full of faith in the modern man's ability to do anything. This clouded our judgment and dulled our caution. As soon as Jack reached out, the creature jumped onto his face and sprayed something from its cheeks. It was a green acid that began to burn his skin. He fell, screaming in agony. Panic erupted among us. Someone kicked the creature away, and we wanted to wash Jack's face, but it was too late. It was an instant death. The acid must have been poisoned. This incident sobered us up, and we realized we were in a dangerous place. We dragged the body to the barrier to return it to his family later, but none of us wanted to go back. Despite encountering danger less than 10 feet in, Jack's screams still echoing in our heads, we continued our journey. Now we were extremely cautious and avoided touching anything. Leaving markers to find our way back, we ventured about 5 miles deep. Along the way, we encountered unknown creatures, and we theorized that this place was not on Earth but on another planet. We confirmed this when we found a giant tree. Despite being here for a while, we had never seen the sky. There was sunlight, but the rays barely penetrated the dense foliage, so it was always twilight. At night, climbing the tree, we finally saw the starry sky. It was incredibly beautiful. Astonishingly, the stars were of different colors, and there were 2 moons. When I saw them, I nearly fell off the branch. It was so shocking. We finally fully realized we were on another planet, and it scared us. We decided to go back. Then disaster struck. As we retraced our steps, the forest suddenly filled with quiet footsteps, as if something small was moving nearby. We froze, listening. The footsteps grew louder, and we instinctively hid behind trees and bushes. From the shadows, small creatures, the size of a 5-year-old child, slowly emerged. Their skin was greenish and covered in tiny scales, their faces elongated with large noses and long, pointed ears. Their eyes glowed bright yellow, and sharp teeth gleamed in the dim light. We were shocked. Could it be that old tales had come to life? Before us stood real goblins, and judging by their appearance, they were far from friendly. These small beings moved quickly and efficiently, clearly possessing intelligence and organization. There were many of them, and they communicated with strange cries and whistles. They held small spears with sharp stone tips, making them even more dangerous. We tried to remain unnoticed, but one of the goblins suddenly turned its head in our direction and froze, staring right at us. Its eyes narrowed, and it screamed, attracting the others' attention. The goblins rushed towards us, and we had to use our weapons. Gunfire erupted, and several goblins fell, but there were too many of them. They were fast and agile, skillfully dodging our shots and attacking from different directions. We fought desperately, but the goblins advanced with incredible speed. Their spears whistled through the air, piercing our bulletproof vests and wounding our people. I saw one of our men, Mike, fall, pierced by a spear in his side. His eyes clouded over and he collapsed to the ground. I kept shooting until my ammo ran out, then grabbed a knife and engaged in close combat. The goblins surrounded us, and each of us fought to the last bullet. But there were too many of them. They attacked from all sides, their claws and teeth tearing at our comrades, and the forest filled with screams of pain and despair. I saw John, our commander, fighting off 3 goblins at once. One of them jumped on him from behind and stabbed a spear into his shoulder. John screamed but continued to fight, throwing the goblin off and stabbing it with his knife. Blood streamed down his face, but he didn't give up. In this chaotic battle, we lost many. Despite their losses, the goblins kept advancing. Their claws and teeth ripped through our comrades, and the forest filled with screams of pain and despair. Finally, realizing the battle was lost, the 3 of us who survived retreated, fending off the pursuing goblins. We ran without looking back, and, thanks to the markers we left, managed to find our way back. Returning to the barrier, we were on the verge of exhaustion but alive. We left all our equipment and hurried to the nearest populated area, deciding never to return to that cursed forest. You could see from the recording that it was difficult for him to tell this story. Robert raised his glass again and drained it to the bottom. Witnessing your comrades' deaths is not something everyone can handle. But this interview blew up the internet. It turned out that another world lay beyond the barrier, and it was dangerous. People were frightened. Immediately, many questions arose. Why did it appear? Could these creatures penetrate our world? A wave of criticism hit the government for hiding the results of the anomaly study. Under public pressure, some information was made public. First, the creatures living beyond the barrier could not penetrate our world. At least, no such cases had been recorded. Second, the barrier has a 90-day cycle. It can be entered at any time, but exiting is only possible once every 90 days. Everyone who entered and exited did so during one of these windows. Third, this world is inhabited by various fantasy creatures and monsters. The government reported many lost military and other personnel who attempted to explore this place. This information caused a furor worldwide. Could it be that the fantasy world had become a reality? Everyone, literally everyone, was discussing this news. Opinions were divided. Some preferred to completely isolate the barrier and not let anyone through, while others said it was better to know about the danger in advance and be prepared rather than live in ignorance. The government leaned towards the second option and opened access to anyone willing to share information. But few were willing to risk their lives. There were rumors that the army had been sent through the barrier with tanks and other equipment, but had been destroyed by an unknown force. Some mentioned a giant wolf. But money rules the world, and this phrase was confirmed when one of the few explorers found a mysterious flower. It was shown on all channels. It resembled a tulip and was purple, but unlike regular flowers, it glowed and emitted mysterious energy. This flower was put up for sale and bought by a billionaire who decided to eat it. And what happened next? He was cured of an incurable disease. the global media were once again abuzz. Such amazing things were hidden in this mysterious place. Immediately, the global market saw demands for these flowers, with offers reaching tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. After this, the number of explorers increased to hundreds of thousands. But this place was truly dangerous. Out of 100 people, only 10 returned. In percentage terms, this was negligible, and not all of them returned with a bounty. Only a few found such flowers, but the greed for profit killed the sense of fear. People continued to flock there in search of luck. Due to the enormous number of casualties in the missing, this area was called the Forest of Death. And the explorers who went there were called F-hunters, from Flowers Hunter. Each year more information came from this place, but many kept their findings secret and did not want to share. Therefore, much of the information appeared on the black market. After all, information is also money. But some of it still surfaced. For example, in the Forest of Death, there were places called anomalies. Stepping into such an anomaly could transport you hundreds of miles in any direction. Or you could get stuck in a disturbance like a web suspended in the air and die of hunger and dehydration. Numerous expeditions proved that it was better not to use firearms in this place. First, loud shots attracted dangerous creatures. Second, the barrier closed for 90 days, so sometimes you got stuck in this forest for 3 months and had no way to replenish your ammunition. Because of this, people returned to medieval weapons: swords, bows, spears, whatever they preferred. Many fencing and archery clubs opened around the world. I was already 12 then, and I remember my father signing me up for such training. It was the last thing he did before he went to the Forest of Death. Yes, he decided to go there because there was so much unknown. My father worked as a biologist and often went on business trips, but this time he was heading to a truly dangerous place. I remember there was a real scandal at home after he announced his intentions. My mother yelled and cried, but he was relentless. He packed his things, said goodbye to us, and left us forever. 8 years have passed, but he never returned. Whether he is alive or well, I do not know. I can't say that hard times came. My mother had a good job, and she had 2 brothers who owned a car repair shop and often helped us. Their names were Bill and Fred. One was tall and thin with blonde hair, the other short and slightly chubby with dark hair. People were often surprised to learn they were brothers because they looked so different. I often visited them, helping with work and learning their trade. 10 years have passed since the meteorite almost fell to Earth, and I'm now 24. I decided not to go to college, but to start working right away. As you might have guessed, I worked for my uncles. We sent my sister to college. Everything was fine until one incident occurred. My mother was diagnosed with a rare type of cancer. This news hit us like an avalanche. I walked around in a daze for a few days, and my sister cried all the time. My mother took it more calmly. The doctors said treatment was impossible, but chemotherapy could be tried, but she refused. They gave her another year. It was a Sunday, and I was sitting on the porch talking to my uncles, who had come to visit my mother. She was the youngest in their family, and they loved her dearly and supported her in every way. We were considering options for what could be done, and only one thing came to mind: to get the Remedian flower. That's what the purple flower that cured all diseases was called. We couldn't buy it. I checked the auctions, and its minimum price started at $57 million. Even if I worked for 100 years, I wouldn't save that much. The only option left was to go to the forest ourselves and try our luck. I told my uncles my plan. Each reacted differently. Uncle Bill silently nodded while Uncle Fred shrank back in fear, dropping part of his burger. He was about to say something when a car stopped in front of the house, and a mailman got out. He walked up to us and asked if Michael Black lived here. I said that was my name, and he handed me a hefty envelope. I signed for it and he left. I was surprised. Who could have sent me a package? Opening it, I found a thick notebook. Its cover was made of roughly tanned brown leather, which had acquired a noble patina over the years. The leather was covered in fine cracks and scratches, testifying to numerous adventures and travels. In the center of the cover was an embossed ancient symbol, possibly a family crest or sign. The edges of the notebook were slightly worn, and the corners rounded from constant use. The cover closed with a leather strap that wrapped around the notebook several times, securing it reliably and neatly. Opening it, I looked at the first page. It said it belonged to Harry Black. Damn, it was my father's notebook. I cursed, and my uncles asked what it was. I began flipping through the pages and realized it was his diary. There were entries about his journey, as well as notes and sketches of creatures and plants in the forest of death. But how did it get to our world? Did it mean my father returned? Or did he send it through someone? I found no message for myself. What did it mean? We studied it for a long time, and after that, Uncle Bill said it was probably fate and our chance. They said they wouldn't let me go alone and would go with me. So we decided. We didn't tell my mother, and my sister was to stay and take care of her. Time was not on our side, so we decided to leave in 2 weeks. During this time, we needed to prepare thoroughly. I started by studying my father's diary. These entries were a treasure trove of information. Any experienced F-hunter would give everything they had for them. I even considered selling the notebook to buy the Remedian, but after some thought I realized it still wouldn't be worth that much. I also started searching the internet for information. I learned a lot of useful things. First, we needed equipment. In the modern world, with many composite materials, there was no need to make armor out of metal. We could buy special hunting armor. It was expensive, but my uncles had savings, so it wasn't a problem. We decided to order a set for each of us. Soon it arrived at the address. When we tried it on, I was genuinely excited because it was magnificent. Made from modern composite materials, it combined lightness and incredible strength. The helmet, made of carbon fiber with polymer inserts, completely covered the head, and the polycarbonate visor provided a full view and was equipped with infrared and thermal imaging sensors. The breastplate with multi-layered Kevlar and ceramic plates protected vital organs, and the cushioning foam inside absorbed impacts. Flexible shoulder and elbow plates made of carbon fiber and titanium did not restrict movement, and Kevlar gloves with reinforced inserts provided a reliable grip. The belt had pockets for ammunition and tools, and the lower part of the armor included durable pants with additional protective plates and reinforced boots. The built-in communication and navigation system, as well as sensors monitoring vital signs, complemented this high-tech equipment. We looked at ourselves in the mirror and were pleased with what we saw. We also needed to learn survival methods in this world since we could get stuck there for years. Fortunately, the internet had the necessary information, and my father's notes were helpful too. We also needed to decide on weapons. I ordered a sturdy short sword for myself. I had been practicing fencing all this time and had become quite skilled with a sword. I also ordered a bow. Uncle Bill chose a large axe, while Uncle Fred preferred a silenced pistol and a full bag of ammunition. For close combat, he chose a large dagger. We chose a time when the barrier was in its 90-day closure period, and there was still a month before it opened, so we had 4 months to get out of there. Otherwise, we would have been stuck there for 7 months. Preparation was going according to plan. The day arrived. We said goodbye to my sister, who was crying the whole time, and visited my mother, of course, not telling her anything. Then we asked a friend to drive us to Yellowstone Park. We didn't take our car, as we didn't know how long we would be stuck in the zone. The journey took half a day. Finally, we arrived. Yellowstone Park, usually filled with tourists and nature lovers, now looked like a war zone. Around the barrier was serious security. Tall metal fences with barbed wire at the top surrounded the area, creating the impression of an impregnable fortress. Watchtowers with spotlights stood at every corner of the fence. At the gates and along the fence, armed military patrols were on duty. Soldiers in full combat gear with rifles slung over their shoulders were ready for any unforeseen situation. Their faces were stern and focused, closely watching everyone who approached the barrier. Near the entrance, a temporary base had been set up. Several tents housed command posts and medical stations. Around the tents, various military vehicles could be seen. Armored personnel carriers ready for quick response in case of an emergency, and heavy trucks loaded with supplies and equipment. Drones occasionally buzzed overhead, patrolling the perimeter from above, their cameras scanning the area for threats. Mobile generators provided electricity for the entire base, and radio towers maintained communication with the outside world. Along the fence, surveillance cameras and motion sensors ensured constant monitoring of the territory. This place seemed impregnable and fully prepared for any surprises. When we approached the gates, we were met by a tall soldier in a strict uniform with a stern look. His rifle hung on his shoulder, ready for immediate use. We presented our passes, which we had ordered in advance. He carefully examined them, comparing them with our documents. We had the minimum allowed number of team members, 3 people, which was optimal. The soldier looked at us once more, then nodded and let us through. The 3 of us walked along the deserted path, and the surrounding forest seemed strangely quiet. Tall trees with dense foliage seemed to loom over us, creating the impression that we were the only people in this vast, ancient forest. Occasionally, a patrol unit passed by, their footsteps echoing dully in the silence, followed by oppressive quiet. Birds did not sing, and even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching our movements. As we approached the barrier, the golden shimmer became more distinct. The tall grass and shrubs along the path gradually gave way to sparse but oddly twisted trees, whose branches reached skyward like grasping hands. The sky was covered with gray clouds, giving the whole landscape a gloomy and ominous appearance. The ground was littered with small stones and tree roots, making us tread carefully to avoid tripping. When we reached the barrier, it stood before us in all its mysterious splendor. The transparent wall, shimmering with golden light, looked unreal, like a mirage. It glimmered and sparkled as if composed of millions of tiny fireflies frozen in the air. The barrier appeared majestic and frightening at the same time, beckoning us with its mysterious glow. We stopped in front of it, feeling a slight vibration in the air. Our hearts were pounding, our breathing became erratic. This place inspired awe and fear. It was unclear what awaited us on the other side, but there was no turning back. I looked at Uncle Bill and Uncle Fred. Determination and fear shone in their eyes. "Ready?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. They nodded. We exchanged one last glance, realizing this might be our last encounter with the reality we knew. At that moment, I felt the full weight of our decision, but there was no going back. We stepped forward. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. A light tingling sensation ran through my body, like an electric shock. The golden shimmer became unbearably bright, and I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened my eyes, the world around us had changed. We stood in a different place. The trees here were taller and denser, their trunks covered in moss, and their branches intertwined, creating a thick canopy that almost completely blocked out daylight. The air was filled with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something undefined that caused anxiety. It felt like the forest was breathing, watching us like a living entity. Every step we took was accompanied by the crunch of twigs underfoot and the rustling of leaves. But these sounds were barely audible over the strange noises coming from all sides. We heard distant howling, muffled growls, as if invisible creatures were communicating, warning of our presence. Occasionally, there was a sound like metal scraping against stone or the sudden flapping of wings, as if something huge was taking off among the trees. Our hearts were pounding in our chests, adrenaline coursing through our veins, making every cell of our bodies alert. We moved cautiously, trying not to make unnecessary noise, feeling the invisible eyes on us. I kept my sword ready, its hilt surprisingly warm in my hand. Uncle Bill gripped his axe, and Uncle Fred held his silenced pistol, periodically glancing around. We cautiously scanned our surroundings, trying to catch the slightest movement in the surrounding darkness. Soon we came to a fork where several paths diverged in different directions, disappearing into the dense forest. Each path seemed equally mysterious and dangerous. We couldn't predict which one would lead us to our goal and which to our demise. Trusting our intuition, we chose a path leading north. The path led us through dense underbrush, where trees intertwined their branches, creating an almost impenetrable canopy overhead. We walked slowly and carefully, trying not to lose our vigilance. I closely examined the surrounding vegetation, hoping to find familiar mushrooms and plants from my father's diary. We had a month's worth of food, but we knew we needed to start looking for food sources early in these conditions. Along the way, I noticed several familiar mushrooms mentioned in my father's diary. Their caps were bright purple with small white spots. My father wrote that they were edible and highly nutritious. I carefully cut a few mushrooms and put them in my bag. Nearby grew other, less familiar plants that also caught my attention. I also noticed some bushes with small berries that my father described as safe to eat. Their dark red fruits were sweet and juicy, perfect for a quick snack while trekking. Fortunately, the first 2 days of our journey went smoothly. We didn't encounter any creatures, and only the rustling of the forest accompanied us. However, on the second day, as the sun began to set, we heard soft footsteps coming from the depths of the forest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end with fear and anticipation. Could it be them? I thought, signaling everyone to hide in the nearest bushes. We froze, holding our breath, watching the path through the foliage. Soon, goblins appeared on the trail, the very ones the first hunter had described. They were small, with green skin and long ears. Their movements were quick and silent, and their eyes gleamed with malice. We saw that there were only 5 of them, and they were carrying a creature in a cage. I didn't know what this creature was. It wasn't even in my father's diary. It looked like a cat, but had 3 tails that swayed gracefully. The tips of its ears had fluffy tufts of fur, resembling the tufts on a lynx. Its entire body was covered in snow-white fur that seemed incredibly soft and fluffy. The only thing that stood out against this snowy white backdrop was its eyes, bright gold, shining like precious gems. The creature looked frightened and exhausted, its ears pressed flat against its head, and its eyes nervously scanned the surroundings. It was entirely unique and mysterious, something out of the deepest realms of fantasy. Even in this strange and dangerous forest, it seemed extraordinarily special. We didn't move, trying not to make a sound to avoid revealing our presence. Our hearts were pounding, and I felt sweat running down my back. But then one of the goblins stopped, turned its head in our direction, and sniffed the air. I cursed silently. These creatures had an incredible sense of smell. The goblin screamed, pointing in our direction, and there was alarm in its cry. "They've spotted us," I whispered, drawing my bow. My uncles also prepared for battle, their faces becoming focused and tense. Uncle Fred was the first to open fire. His silenced pistol made a quiet puff, and the first goblin fell to the ground with a hole in its head. 2 other goblins scattered, trying to take cover behind trees. I released an arrow that pierced one of them in the shoulder, causing it to drop the cage with the mysterious creature. Uncle Bill charged forward with his axe, swinging it in a deadly arc. Uncle Fred didn't miss. A few more quiet shots, and 2 more goblins fell dead. But the remaining goblin managed to draw a knife and charged at me. I dropped my bow and drew my sword, engaging in close combat. The goblin was fast and aggressive, its strikes precise and powerful. But my armor, made from composite materials, deflected several blows, giving me a chance to counterattack. I struck, aiming for the goblin's side, and my sword's blade cut through its flesh, making it shriek in pain. It tried to strike me again, but Uncle Bill arrived just in time, decapitating the goblin with his axe. When the last one fell, we stood among the bodies, breathing heavily. Fred still held his pistol ready, scanning the surroundings. Uncle Bill slowly lowered his axe, and I released the hilt of my sword, realizing the fight was over. "We did it," I exhaled, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Good job, guys," Uncle Bill said, patting my shoulder. We inspected the bodies and then turned our attention to the cage with the mysterious creature still inside. It looked at us with its bright golden eyes, as if evaluating our intentions. We decided to free the mysterious creature, being careful not to touch it, as it could be dangerous. After opening the cage, I stepped back, waiting to see what it would do. Suddenly, the creature quickly jumped out of the cage and ran toward me. It leaped onto my shoulder and settled there, like an ordinary house cat. I froze, unsure of how to react. "What the?" I muttered, carefully trying to pick up the creature and put it on the ground. But it jumped back onto my shoulder, as if deciding this was its new place. "Looks like it likes you," Uncle Fred said with a grin. We exchanged glances and decided to keep the creature with us. We needed to leave the area quickly, as we could encounter more goblins or even more dangerous creatures. We quickly gathered our things and continued on our way, moving further north. Another couple of days passed. Along the way we encountered many strange fantasy creatures but tried to pass by quietly to avoid incidents. We saw firefly dragons, tiny dragons whose wings glowed with a soft blue light like fireflies. They fluttered between the trees, leaving glowing trails. In one of the swamps, we noticed bog fairies, creatures with transparent wings and seaweed instead of hair, their eyes glowing in the twilight, and their voices singing melodies that sounded like calls from the depths. We also met a flock of shadow ravens, large black birds with eyes glowing with green fire and long claws on their feet. They perched on the branches of tall trees, watching us closely without making any move to attack. On the 5th day, luck finally smiled on us. The cat, whom I had named Ed, began to fidget on my shoulder, as if something was bothering him. Then he stubbornly tried to lead us to the left of the path. I decided this was not a coincidence, and told my uncles to follow me. We carefully made our way through the bushes, and after about 100 feet, we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood a huge ancient tree, its branches forming graceful arches overhead. But the most remarkable thing was that next to the tree on the ground grew a purple flower, the very one we were looking for. My heart beat faster, and I wanted to rush forward. But Uncle Bill grabbed my shoulder. "Don't rush," he warned. I came to my senses and realized I could have endangered all of us. We crouched and carefully moved across the clearing. Almost reaching the flower, we suddenly heard a deep voice ordering us to stop. I froze in fear and began to look around, but saw no one. Glancing at my uncle's faces, I saw they were filled with horror. Following their gaze, I saw the tree, and it had a huge face. This face looked as if it were carved from the tree's very bark, but it appeared alive. The eyes, deep and wise, seemed to look through us. The large nose, with a rough surface, and lips, sculpted by nature, moved slowly as the tree spoke. The roots at the base of the tree writhed like snakes, and the leaves on the branches rustled softly, as if it were breathing. The tree looked at us with its ancient eyes and said, "I know you want to take the flower, but to do so you must solve my riddle. If you fail, you will face death." We stood, pondering its words, trying to find the right answer. The riddle was, "I cannot be seen, but I can be felt. I have no form, but I can fill any space. What am I?" We thought hard, and Uncle Fred decided to answer. "It's a shadow," he exclaimed. But the tree just shook its head, its eyes glowing. "Incorrect," it boomed, and the flower immediately retracted into the ground as if it had never existed. I cursed and rushed to the spot where it had just been, but it was useless. At that moment, the tree opened its mouth and screamed. The scream was deafening, piercing to the bone. The forest answered with thousands of voices, and we realized that all the monsters in the area were coming our way. "Run!" Uncle Bill shouted, and we bolted from the clearing. We raced through the dense forest, leaping over roots and bushes, trying not to look back. Around us we heard the approaching footsteps and roars of monsters summoned by the tree's cry. We ran, not knowing the way, and soon found ourselves in a silvery, transparent cloud. "What is this?" Uncle Fred shouted, but it was too late. I realized we had entered an anomaly but couldn't do anything. Everything around us swirled, and the world began to blur before my eyes. The last thing I heard was a deafening roar before I lost consciousness. I woke up realizing I was being dragged somewhere. Opening my eyes, I saw the treetops above me. Struggling to lift my head, I saw that I was tied up and being dragged. Next to me lay Uncle Fred, still unconscious. We were being dragged across the ground, and every bump of stones and roots against our bodies made me wince in pain. I squinted and looked at who was dragging us. My heart sank when I realized we were doomed. This creature was one of the most dangerous in the forest. In his journal, my father called it the Butcher. It was a massive man, his face hidden under a gas mask. Whether he was human or a monster remained a mystery. Most likely the latter, as two enormous antlers grew from his head. He wore no clothing on his upper body, just pants and massive boots. His belt was adorned with skulls, and in one hand he held a huge axe. With the other, he dragged us by a rope, pulling us along the ground. My clothes were already filled with grass and dirt. Fear and horror gripped me. We were in the hands of the most dangerous creature in the forest, and our chances of rescue seemed slim. The forest around us was dense and dark, the rustling and sounds growing louder with each step of the Butcher. Soon, Uncle Fred began to wake up. He opened his eyes slightly and whispered, "Where are we? What's happening?" "Quiet!" I hissed at him, fearing to attract our captor's attention. The butcher continued to drag us through the forest, his steps heavy and confident. Every movement of his massive body seemed like a threat. Soon we approached a small cabin next to which stood an old, dilapidated shed. The cabin was made of old logs covered in moss and dirt. It looked abandoned, but no less frightening. The windows were boarded up, the door crooked and creaking ominously with every movement. Next to it stood the shed, even more decrepit. The wooden walls of the shed were half collapsed, and the roof was caving in. Scattered around were numerous bones and skulls, intensifying the sense of dread. The butcher dragged us further, heading toward the old shed. Each of his movements was smooth and confident, like a predator sure of its prey. We tried to resist, but the ropes were too tight, and his strength overwhelmed any attempt to break free. When we were dragged into the shed, our terror only grew. Inside, it was dark and damp. Hanging from the ceiling were 2 ropes, to which corpses were tied, swaying back and forth, emitting a faint creaking sound. The corpses were in a state of decomposition, their faces and bodies mutilated. The smell of death and decay filled the air, making it hard to breathe. The butcher easily lifted me and tied me to one of the beams. The rope wound around my body, making movement impossible. His hands were rough and strong like steel clamps. I felt my head spin from fear and pain as he tightened the knots. "Please don't," I whispered, but my voice was lost in the silence of the shed. He then tied Uncle Fred to the neighboring beam in the same manner. Fred tried to resist, but all his efforts were in vain. We both ended up tied and helpless, hanging like puppets in this horrific place. The shed was dimly lit only by the weak light seeping through the cracks in the walls. The floor was covered in dirt, bloody stains, and remains. In the corner stood an old, rusty saw, and nearby lay several severed limbs. In another corner, various torture tools were visible. Hooks, knives, hammers, all looking terrifying and sinister. The butcher stood before us, his gas mask hiding his face, but I could feel his cold, soulless eyes watching us. We hung helplessly, our hearts pounding with fear, and our minds refusing to accept what was happening. At that moment, we realized the hopelessness of our situation and the horror awaiting us. Blood rushed to my head, making me feel worse. Soon, the butcher left, leaving us hanging in this nightmarish shed. I began to think about Uncle Bill. I hoped he was all right, the thought crossing my mind before my consciousness blurred with pain and fear. We hung there for some time when I suddenly heard a rustling. Soon, a white creature appeared before me. It was Ed. I felt a bit of relief, although I understood that he was unlikely to help us. He approached and came closer to me, and with the last of my strength I whispered, "Help us." Ed looked at me intently with his golden eyes, and it seemed he understood my words. Turning around, he bounded outside. We continued hanging, and I didn't know how much time had passed, but it seemed like my end was near. I looked at Uncle Fred. He was red as a beet, blood rushing to his head, and he looked on the verge of losing consciousness. Soon I heard a noise outside. The butcher had returned. He untied our ropes and dragged us outside. In front of the house, we saw a huge bonfire with a massive cauldron hanging over it. Something inside was bubbling and boiling. A thought flashed through my mind that this was the end when the butcher dragged us closer to the fire and threw us to the ground. We lay on the cold ground, feeling the heat from the fire, and watched as the butcher went into the house. Fear and terror gripped me, but a flicker of hope still lingered somewhere in my mind. After the butcher went into the house, small creatures began emerging from the door. They were vile and disgusting, their appearance instilling disgust and fear. These creatures were no more than 3 feet tall, with thin, skeletal bodies covered in gray-green, scaly skin. Their heads were disproportionately large, with huge eyes glowing with a dim, yellowish light. Their mouths, full of small, sharp teeth, were twisted in a grim smirk, and long claws on their hands and feet added to their sinister appearance. Their ears were long and pointed like those of bats, and their noses were thin and hooked. Each creature wore a dirty, tattered rag that seemed to have once been clothing, but now only emphasized their ugliness. Green, viscous saliva dripped from their mouths, leaving sticky trails on the ground. They surrounded us, pulling at our hair, ears, and noses, examining us with their disgusting hands. Their touch was cold and rough, and each contact sent waves of revulsion and pain through us. They chattered among themselves in an incomprehensible language, their voices high-pitched and piercing like the screeching of enraged rats. "Get away!" I shouted, trying to fend them off, but they only laughed with their raspy laughter and continued their disgusting games. Soon they began to dance around the fire in a chaotic and unnatural manner, like puppets on strings. Their glowing eyes flickered in the firelight, creating the illusion of sinister flames dancing in the night. They danced, mocking and shrieking, their voices merging into one horrifying cacophony. The fire burned brightly, the flames greedily consuming the wood, and the small creatures continued their eerie ritual. They jumped, twisted, and occasionally threw small objects into the fire that they pulled from their rags. Bones, tufts of fur, small skulls. The flames flared up even more, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. I felt fear gripping me tighter and tighter. Uncle Fred was in the same state, his face white and his eyes full of terror. We were helpless, tied up and surrounded by these vile creatures, and every moment felt like an eternity. Suddenly, I heard a loud roar somewhere nearby, then the sound of footsteps and breaking trees approaching from the forest. The series of nightmares seemed never-ending. I no longer wanted to think about anything when suddenly I heard the sound of a horn, echoing from all directions. The small monsters began to panic, their movements becoming chaotic and erratic. The butcher emerged from the house, his head concealed under a gas mask, quickly scanning the area for unwanted guests. Suddenly something fell nearby, and I realized it was a smoke grenade. Its thick, acrid smoke quickly filled the area, obscuring the view. I felt someone grab me and start pulling. Unable to resist, I let this unknown person drag me out of the smoke. Soon we were in the forest, and I realized I was being pulled by a group of people in ordinary hunting clothes. They dragged me to a safe distance, then began cutting the rope, freeing me. Nearby, I saw Uncle Fred, who had also been rescued. All the faces were unfamiliar to me, but I was glad we had been freed. One by one, they helped us to our feet and told us to follow them. Everything happened in a hurry, as the monsters were chasing us. We ran through the forest, hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. Trees blurred past us, their branches whipping our faces and bodies, but we didn't stop. In the distance, a terrifying roar could be heard, urging us onward. The hunters who saved us moved confidently and quickly, knowing exactly where to go. We crossed streams, climbed over fallen trees, and pushed through dense thickets. The forest seemed endless, and every step was a struggle. The hunters covered us, occasionally glancing back to check if the monsters were getting closer. The noise of the chase didn't abate, but we kept running, not letting fear overtake us. Eventually, we burst into a small clearing surrounded by thick bushes. The hunters quickly organized a defense, positioning themselves around us and preparing for a possible attack. Uncle Fred and I were breathing heavily, but we understood that we were finally in relative safety. "Are you okay?" asked one of the hunters. a tall man with sharp features and piercing eyes. "Yes, thank you," I replied, still recovering from the horror we'd just experienced. "We need to leave here," said another hunter. "Those monsters won't stop." We nodded and, gathering the last of our strength, continued through the forest. The sounds of the chase gradually faded, and we managed with difficulty to lose the monsters. Soon we emerged at a small village consisting of a dozen houses. The houses were simple, wooden with thatched roofs, but they looked sturdy and reliable. Along the narrow, trodden paths stood people, busy with their tasks. Some were mending nets, others were handling supplies, and some were cleaning weapons. Seeing us, they turned in surprise, whispering among themselves, discussing our group. Leading our group was a woman. She was tall and slender, with sharp facial features and expressive green eyes. Her long, dark hair was braided into a tight plait that hung down to her waist. She wore practical hunting clothes, a leather jacket with numerous pockets filled with various tools and supplies. She moved with confidence and grace, as if she knew every path in this forest. "What is this place?" I asked her as we walked through the village. "Where are we going?" "This is a camp of surviving hunters," she replied without slowing her pace. "We're going to see our leader. He will want to talk to you." We reached a house in the center of the village. This house was slightly larger than the others and looked better maintained. In front of the house was a small garden with flowers and herbs, and above the entrance hung an amulet made of bones and feathers. As we approached, a man came out of the house. He was fit and confident looking. His face seemed familiar to me. I stared at him, and suddenly it hit me. It was Joe, the very guy who had discovered the meteorite. But what was he doing here? "Joe!" I blurted out. He looked at me, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Yes, it's me," he replied, coming closer. "Welcome to our camp. I'm glad you're alive." "But what are you doing here?" I asked, still not believing my eyes. "It's a long story," he smiled. "Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." We entered the house, where the interior was cozy. There were wooden tables and chairs, and maps and hunting trophies adorned the walls. Joe gestured for us to sit. I asked him what this camp was, and he looked at us in surprise. "Didn't they tell you? You've ended up in the second zone." "What?" I asked, confused. "What's the second zone?" He looked at us even more surprised and asked, "Didn't you pass through the red barrier?" We exchanged glances and told him our story about how we ended up in this part of the forest. Joe listened attentively, his expression growing more serious. "I'm sorry to tell you this," he finally said, "but you've entered a new level of the forest. There's no way out from here." Hearing his words, I felt a cold fear grip my heart. Remembering my mother, I felt deep anxiety and pain. What would happen to her if we never managed to return? "How come?" Uncle Fred asked desperately. "There must be some way out." Joe shook his head. "We've studied this forest for a long time and know that the second zone is a trap. It's designed so that people who end up here can't go back. We ourselves got here several years ago and have been trying to find a way out ever since. But so far, without success." I hung my head, feeling growing hopelessness. Questions and fears swirled in my mind, but one thing was clear. We were stuck in this sinister forest, and our hope for salvation was becoming increasingly elusive.